This first video will cover the mixing mindset and all the things you'll need to consider when mixing drums. So when mixing in general, it's essential to understand the importance of each element within the track. Now it's safe to say that if a track has drums in it, then those drums will be one of the most important groups of elements. This is because in most cases, the drums determine the rhythm, groove, and tempo of the track. The drum will have the kick and the snare, which are vital for anchoring rhythm, as well as the other percussive elements that will determine the groove and overall feel of that drum track. In drums especially, there are other things to consider, such as the placement of each element within the group. A scenario where this will come in handy is possibly a club situation where the sound system will most likely be mono, but we'll cover this more in a detailed video later on. So, where's the best place to start when mixing drums? The best place to start really when mixing drums would be from the most important drum down. Now, if we look at the icon here I have for the first track in this Logic session, I've got an overall plan view for a basic drum kit. Now, this is an acoustic drum kit layout. However, this could still apply for programmed or electronic drums. The drums themselves may change in name, but their general category within the drum group will kind of stay the same. So if we look here, we've got a plan view of a drum kit. This symbol here just replicates the drummer facing forward, and then we have the various drums laid out as they would be in a standard conventional drum kit. So first of all, we have in red the kick and the snare. Now these two are placed in red because they're considered probably the most important part of any drum group. These two elements are what would determine the overall tempo of the track and the general anchor of the track, so the basic rhythm. As we move on through the others here, we can see we've got in yellow, so these would consist of things like hi-hats, open and closed, any crashes and any sort of rides. For electronic purposes, the hi-hats will probably stay the same, and the crash and the ride may be different samples. It could be electronically produced, it could be done from a noise source, but they would take up the space of what would be considered a conventional crash or ride cymbal. Next we have the blue drums. So these on a conventional kit would be your toms. So you have your high tom, your mid tom, and then your floor tom. Now these in electronic purposes may be specific toms if you're looking at drum machines like the 909 and the 808 and so on. However, these might not be toms within your track. These could be things like wood blocks. These could be just other forms of percussive elements within the track. But if we look at this and we look at the color coding, the red drums are the most important drums within the track. So this is a really good place to start when looking at organizing the track, EQing the track, balancing the track, everything. So the kick and the snare are a really good place to start. Next, we can then look at the higher frequency information, so things like hi-hats, crashes, and rides. Again, in terms of their overall volume, their frequency content, but now looking more into where they're going to be placed within the stereo field. We could stick to a conventional layout here from a drummer's perspective or an audience perspective, but it's just definitely something to keep an eye out for and just to consider. These would probably be the next best things to start working on. And then we can move to the blue drums here, the other percussion, as these probably won't appear as much as the other drums within your drum track. You'd mostly find these within fills or ends of phrases, whereas the kick and the snare might run throughout, as well as the hi-hats and the rides and so on, that will play a part in the overall groove and feel of the track. Next, we're going to start to import some stems and get mixing with these drums. We're also going to leave this track open here with no information in it, but just an indication as to our overall drum kit plan, because this might come in handy later on. So now it's time to start mixing. I'm going to drag in some stems that I've been given for this drum mix, and I'm going to create new tracks. Now this is going to import all of those tracks in alphabetical order into our Logic project. Now this is okay if you've labeled tracks 1 through to however many number of stems there are. However, you will need to reorganize the tracks if Logic brings them in alphabetical order. So if we go back to our drum plan here, we can order the drums from top to bottom in terms of their importance. Now this could be determined by how often they show up within the track, or it could be determined by how important they are in terms of determining the overall feel, groove, and rhythm of the track. A good place to start, as mentioned before, would be the kick and the snare. So we'll go through all of these tracks and find the kicks and snare files. Luckily, we can see that all of the tracks have been labeled, so we can go through and find the tracks and not the clips. This is quite important to understand. It's really good practice to get in the habit of moving tracks instead of clips, because later on when you have different processing on individual tracks, if you move the audio file to that track, that audio file will now be getting that processing. So making sure you move tracks instead of clips is only going to reorder the tracks that you have, rather than placing audio files in different processing channel strips. So let's get on with moving these kicks around. Let's move the kicks to the top. And we can see at this point, we start with the kick track that has the most amount of information in it. Now we can move down to the snares. You can see I've got 2 snare tracks here. So let's move these up. We have another 2 snare tracks here. Let's keep looking through to see if there are any other snare tracks. No, that looks like everything so far. Next, we can look at starting to add in some of our metal information. So we're going to start with the hi-hats. We do have a hi-hat track here that starts from the very beginning of the track, so this can be our most dominant hi-hat track. We then have some open hats, those can stay where they are. We then have a hats left and right here, so let's drag these up underneath. And let's go back through the track, see if we've got any more hat tracks. Looks like we have a hats R here. It doesn't look like we have a hats left. However, we do have a shaker and a shaker left. At the moment, it doesn't look like there's a lot of information within these tracks. So what we can do to try and combat that is just take advantage of this waveform zoom here. Now this doesn't change the gain of the track at all. It literally just zooms the waveform visual, so it doesn't do anything to the amplitude of the track. Now as you can see, if this was all the way down, it looks like there's no information within these tracks. However, when I lift the zoom, you can see that the hats right and the shakers left are playing in the same areas. So we can kind of treat these as a pair just for now. I'm going to drag and drop these to the top as they appear what looks like the same time as the main hats. Let's look further down the session, see if we've got any more hat information. We have a shaker here, which again looks like it's playing the same sections. And then as we move down, we've got more percussive elements. Tambourines, rim shots, we've got some rides and crashes here. So let me bring the ride up towards the crash. We have percussion right here. It's nice that we've got an indication as to where the artist wants those parts panned, left and right. So next I'm going to drag the percussion loop. I'm going to move the crash, the ride, and the other effects type elements here, lower down in the session, as well as these tambourine transitions. Now the reason I'm going to do this is because these appear the least amount within the track. As you can see as I'm going through the parts here, if I just move this one up slightly, we're arranging our drums not just in order of how important they are in terms of their sound, but how often they appear and where they start from. So as you can see, other than our loops here, everything is ordered from order of appearance. So the least amount of times it appears within the track, the lower of importance they are within the track in terms of their mixing. It might be that the crashes are extremely important to indicate certain changes within the track or transitions. However, they don't hold down a very important part in terms of the overall rhythm, feel and groove of the track. The kicks and the snares do, moving into the hi-hat elements and the percussive elements. Now we've got an order for our tracks. Let's colour them up. I'm going to press the key command Option C to get up the colour palette. I'm going to make my kicks red. I'm going to take all of my snare tracks, make them blue. I'm going to take my hi-hats. I'm going to make these green. I'm then going to take our percussive elements, make those purple, and then lastly, I'll make our effects or transition style drums orange. As you can see now, we have a relative order for how important or where we're going to start mixing these drums from. We can start with the kicks, working into the snares. Then we can add in our hi-hat elements to start to get more of a groove and feel of the track. And then we can start to move down into our percussive elements and then make sure that our transition style effects balance in terms of their loudness and placement to the rest of our drums. Later as we move through the mix, we might move some of these tracks up into different categories within the drums. For instance, our percussion loops here, because they start quite early on in the track, I might move these up underneath the snares first before we go into hi-hats. But first of all, just in terms of our overall organisation, we're now in a place where we can start to look at the balance of each of our drums. Now we've got our tracks in order, we can look at balancing all of these together in order to get a general first pre-mix of our drums. To do this, I'm going to open up the mixer in Logic. so I can preview how loud each of our individual elements are on first play. Now all we've done so far is drag and drop the stems in. So as long as our faders are at unity gain or 0, we'll be getting a true representation of the drum's volume so far. What I'm going to do is play the track and listen through to each of the individual parts. Now the importance of our drums run from top to bottom, so we would hope to see, within our mixer, the highest levels on the left moving slowly down in volume as we go through into our percussion parts, as the kicks and snares would in most cases need to be the loudest part of the drums. Then moving into the hi-hat parts, and then into our secondary percussion. So let's have a play through the track. I'm going to move up to the next section of the track here, where we can see most of the drums are in. And then again towards the end of the track. Now what we can see when we look here is that our kick drum is coming in at around about -9 dB, but there are other elements of the track, such as the hi-hats, that go slightly higher than that. Now our hi-hats shouldn't be louder, in theory, than our kicks are. Now instead of pulling down the overall volume faders here, which is just turning down the overall output volume, what I'm going to do is adjust the gain of the file itself. So the files that I can see that are slightly higher than they should be, like the hats here, I can see, if I just unzoom my waveform here, that if my kick is at -9 and my hi-hats are at -6, these are slightly too high compared to my kick. So I'm going to come to the region panel, make sure that the correct file itself is selected, and I'm going to pull the volume of this down by maybe 4 decibels. Okay, so now listening through to the track, we've adjusted only a couple of the files here, but it gives us a nicer or smoother curve from the highest point down to the quieter points within the track. Now you can see that some of these are -17, -15 and so on. However, there are quite a few of them which will be layering up in sound, meaning that even though the snare track here is -17, the accumulation of all of the snares together is going to add up to more than that overall in terms of its peak, far closer to -9 where the kicks will be. We can hear that some of our transition effects here, like the crashes, were quite loud and overpowering and extremely dry at the minute. So later on we're going to start to experiment with some effects and making these stand out in the mix and maybe last a little bit longer in terms of their sustain. So now we've adjusted some of the gains of the tracks, we're in a good place where we can start to look at that overall balance in terms of the stem's output volumes. To do this, I'm going to work from the last section of the track here, where we can see most of the drum elements are active. Before we do anything more in here, I'm going to want to make sure that wherever I need to get in the track, I'm going to be able to get there on a basis of marker and in terms of bars. Now this is an electronic track which has quite a rigid structure. There's not many changes where you get non-multiples of 8 as different sections of the track. So in order to do this, we just need to determine the BPM of the session. One of the best ways to do this, especially when you've got a constant running kick drum, is to take the kick drum track and navigate to the BPM meter. This tells me we're at 129. So I put that into the track. Next, just to be on the safe side, we're going to zoom into the very start of the track and make sure that on the 1, we start nice and clean. That's good enough to start with. So now as I zoom back in, so just at this point of the track, I'm going to add in a quick marker. Name this last drop. And now we can start to get an overall balance for our track. I'm going to loop over our last section here. And now open up our mixer. So what we're looking for at this stage is an overall output balance for all of our drums together. We've picked a section of the track where most of the drums are playing, so we're going to get a nice overview of all of our volumes put together. I'm going to give us the most amount of room to see the most amount of faders within our drum track here. In order to see all of the drums we're going to need, as we're 1 short, I'm just going to come up to our view here and go to Hide Legend. This will get rid of this panel here. So now I have a full overview of every single track within the mix, without having to change screens. So what I was doing there was going through each of the individual elements themselves and then working on a groups basis. Now this was made quite easy just due to the fact that I had all of these color coded, but it gave me the option to click and drag over a section of tracks that I wanted after I'd gained an overall balance, and then have a relative balance within my original balance. I could then solo and mute different parts so I could hear the tracks without those hi-hats, and as you saw I took the hi-hats completely out and then bled them into the mix underneath the kick, snares and percussion. And then the same sort of thing with our percussive elements. So now we've got a general balance, we can now start to look at the overall panning of each of these elements. In this video, we're going to look at the panning of our individual elements to create a nice stereo width for our drum track. To start with, we're going to open up the mixer again. Now the kicks and the snares are most likely going to stay in mono. So just to start with, let's solo our kicks and snares. And just make sure that the balance between them is good enough at this point. So all I was doing there was separating the two snares just so we could hear a definite difference between the two. We can hear we've got a more dominant snare here, and then we've got a higher percussive or more of a brush style sound to this second snare or snare number 5. Snare number 2 here is just on the offbeat. So the kicks and snares, I'm not going to mess around with any of the panning here. What I am going to do is work on the hi-hats. So let's listen to the hi-hats and the kicks and snares together. Now we can see, even though we're at center panning, we're dealing with stereo files. And if we look at the overall output of our mix here, we can see we do have a stereo image. To see this further, I'm going to go down to the metering plugins and go to the multimeter and just have a look at our overall stereo balance. You can see here that it is slightly out of mono. But it's still quite central within the mix, but we couldn't technically call this mono. What I am going to do is look at the overall text that's been given to us within the file to give us an indication as to where these files should be panned. Now we can see we've got a hats right, a shaker left, an open left, another hats left, and another hats right. I'm just going to slowly rearrange these tracks. So you have a left and a right, a left and a right, and then an overall left again at the end. Now we're going to listen through to these and just pan these out in solo just to hear them on their own. I'm going to leave that one central. I'm going to pan this slightly left according to the file name. And now play with the relationship between the left-hand shaker and the right hat. What we're trying to do is make these hi-hats hug around the outsides of these snares and kicks. So let's bring the snares and kicks back in. Now we can see that this track is labelled open hats left or L, but we can see from the audio file that it's quite right heavy. see we have these Joko hats here. Let's just listen to these on their own. And here we can see we have a left and a right. Now, as you can hear from this, if we again have a look at this, we can hear these are slightly going out of phase with each other. So this hard panning left and right isn't going to work. We might need to pull these further inside the mix. Again, let's have a look at this correlation meter while we do this. Just here. Okay, again at this point, just check our correlation. So we can see we're fully in phase and we're getting a slightly wider stereo width already. Now let's move into our shaker section. So this has already got quite a smooth stereo field. And so is this loop. So these can stay as they are. This track here sounds quite nice. Slightly off to the left. Now at this stage I'm quite liking the balance that we've got there, but there are some things that I have in mind to do later. Maybe some sidechain compression and definitely some sort of envelope shaping or transient shaping, especially for some of these percussive elements, just to aid the groove of the track. But so far the general balance of these drums, we haven't gone anything too wide. We've kept quite a nice solid bass with our central kick and snare, and the hi-hats are just hugging around our main dominant areas. Now let's go in and have a look at our orange sections, or our transition effects. It's a nicer balance here. So that's a nice balance now with our effects and the rest of our drum tracks. Again, I've got some ideas for these effects here, more reverb, maybe some more modulation style effects and automation to make those transitions sound a little bit more creative. But we'll get onto that a little bit later on in the course. So now we've got an overall gain balance, an output volume balance, and a starting point for a panning balance. The next thing we can look at is the timing of all of these parts. Now, even in electronic music, especially when dealing with things like loops, it's really important to make sure that the timing of your percussive elements are always in sync with each other. Now, at first glance, that just might mean making sure they're the right tempo and they start and finish on seamless loops. But the next things to think about is the actual groove of those, or the swing of those. Now, the kicks and the snares, because they're quite rigid and to grid, don't necessarily need as much attention when it comes to quantization or flexing of the time. Things like hi-hats and percussive elements, these are the elements that are a good starting point to look at to make sure that there's no clashes in terms of swing or feel and groove with our percussive parts. Let's listen through to the track again and try and determine if this track has a designated swing or an obvious swing. So if we listen to these two tracks here, we've got our dance tambourines and our shakers. We can hear that our shakers have quite an obvious swing to them, whereas our dance tambourines are far closer and more rigid to the grid. Now, even though this isn't as obvious straight away in terms of its overall feel, we'll be able to create a far tighter groove if we make sure that both of these files are working with the same swing. Now in Logic, there's a few ways we can do this. We could do this manually by cutting up audio and moving it around, or we could take advantage of Logic's flex time algorithms. Now just by clicking this icon here, we can see that our arrangement page has changed. What I'm going to do is select all of our percussive elements within the track and put these into a flexible state. What this will do is it will look at the transients of each of our drum sounds and place a transient marker down. It will then move that transient marker forward or backwards to the closest grid amount that we decide, kind of like quantizing of MIDI. So to start with, I'm going to pick from this selection of algorithms the rhythmic algorithm. This will go through each of the tracks and analyze each of the transients within those tracks, and then what we should see over here is the option for quantization. And as you can see, we now have quantization as an option here with a possible swing amount. And the view of our audio tracks has changed. If I zoom in here, you will see each individual transient point that Logic suggests is a percussive section within the sound is labelled with a dotted line. What I can do at this point is select the tracks that I have within this mode. As you can see, none of my other tracks are in a flexible state. Only the ones with the blue icon are. And now I can pick one of many Logic templates for quantization. Now the original swing of this shaker loop here sounded close to something like a 16C swing. So I'm going to undo that quickly and play it as it is. So if I just solo our dance tambourine here and put this back to no quantization, you can hear it's quite rigid to the grid. If I go back to my 16D swing, it adds to the swing the same as our shakers. To demonstrate this even further, just to see how far out we can go, I'm going to come down to maybe a 8th triplet. Now bearing in mind this might not sound very good straight away, it just gives you an indication as to what you can do with drums to create various creative sections in your drum tracks. A completely different section, maybe a possibility for a bridge. Let's go back to the 16D and bring the rest of the drums in. At this point, we can decide to turn on or off our flex algorithm. This will give us a good A-B or a bypassing to be able to hear what we're adding and if we're actually doing any good or any bad. As you can see, it's a very slight difference, but that slight difference already clears up some of the space within the mix without having to deal with any sort of EQ or dynamics processing. And have our swing amount change here as a percentage. So I'm going to keep this at a 16th note swing, and I'm going to have control over the percentage here. I can come out of this view and now not have to worry about changing any other parts in terms of their timing. We didn't look at the hats yet, but for now, it doesn't sound like these would need much of a change. Let's just listen back again. As you can hear, they're already quite swung. Let's just try this just to see if it's going to make a difference. It's always worth trying just to see if it works or not. In some cases it won't work, but at least you'll know that it doesn't work. And it might give you an effect that might not work for this sort of thing, but will work for something else in the future. So we're going to pick the same quantization standard. As you can see here, these three hat tracks have no changes whatsoever. So this gives us an indication that these were already in a 16th note quantization with a 65% swing amount. And as you can see, there's only some slight changes in the rest of the files. I might choose to do this as well on this one snare fill, just to make sure that the rhythm of this snare fill follows the same rhythm and groove as the rest of our percussion. As you can see here, it's only two that have been changed. So as you can see here, what that's done has given us a almost spin back style vinyl effect here. What I might do is change this to slicing. As you can see again, we get that difference where it sounds like it's being pulled back in terms of its timing. So for this, I'm going to leave it off here, as it really is changing the overall sound of our snare fills. But it's a good thing that we've tried it, and we've seen that in some cases, it just doesn't work. But now I know that that effect might work for maybe some of the kicks, to be able to create a spin back kick effect later on in the track. Now we're at the stage where it's a good idea to start grouping our sounds together for processing purposes. So far we've organised the tracks and we've given them a colour coding category, but now we're going to put them into their own individual groups and then create something called a drum bus. So first of all, we're going to select our kicks here, and I'm going to press the key command Shift Command and D, and I'm going to create a summing stack, not a folder stack. Now the difference between these two is that while a folder stack will put all of the tracks that you have selected within a folder and give you options for volume, mute and solo, a summing stack will do exactly the same thing. However, it will also give you a chain of possible plugins to work with and give that group a bus number. So I'm going to create a summing stack here. It's called Sum1, so I'll rename this Kicks. And as you can see, the input of this folder is bus 1. So now I have an overall solo and mute for our kicks. And now I can drop that folder down. So before, where I was soloing an amount of tracks in order to hear them, I can now do this if I put these within that group. So for the snares, we'll do the same thing, Shift Command and D, and a summing stack. We can see this is bus 2. I'll do the same for our hats. Now, even though all of the parts that are in here may not necessarily be hats, this is the kind of group that I'm going to be using for my hats. And then lastly, we'll call this percussion. And again, this is purely for personal reasons. You may want to call these high percussion or main percussion and secondary percussion. It's completely up to you. But understanding the importance of putting the different categories within their groups, whatever those categories are, is going to give you more options later. Lastly, for the summing stack, I'm going to call these effects percussion. So now I have 5 groups: kicks, snares, hats, percussion, and our effects. Let's go back to the last drop here. Okay, I'm going to come down to our mixer and we can see this is represented here. And I'll just give these their correct colour. But now at this stage, I'm going to create a new auxiliary track. And this is where all of our individual drum categories are going to feed. So far we've got all our kicks in our kick category, snares in the snares and so on. But we want all of these drums to go to their own dedicated output. To do this, I'm going to go to Options and create a new auxiliary channel strip. I'm going to make the input of this channel strip the next available bus. You can see here that I already have some pre-labeled in Logic for purposes such as this. So I'm going to go to bus 20, which has got drum bus allocated to it. I'm going to put this up to unity gain, call this drum bus, then set the output of all of our individual categories to that bus. So now I have an overall volume, mute, solo, pan, and effects chain for our drums as a whole, as well as the same thing for each of our individual categories. Our drum bus here can give us the overall tone of our drums, as well as an overall volume, so we can at a later date start to balance our drums as a whole into the rest of the track, and follow on from that top-down mixing technique we've spoken about in other courses here at the Streaky Academy. As mentioned in the last video, the top-down method, what we're going to do for the start of the processing of our drums is start from the drum bus, then work our way down into the group sections, and then into the individual parts. As you can see at the end of the last video, we brought our drums down by 1.4 decibels in terms of their overall drum bus output volume, so we're reaching around about -6 to -7 decibels in terms of output or peak volume. We can see here that those effects percussive elements were bringing the peak up quite high, but only at the start of the transition periods. So we've got a nice overall balance here on the output volume, but this means that we are 1.4 dB down as we've lowered the volume here. So we know that we'll be hitting any processing coming in here at maybe around about -5 dB, which is okay for now. So the first thing we're going to do is open up an equalizer for our drum bus. Here we can look at the overall frequency content of our drums as a whole, but we can also start to add and carve away any unwanted or good frequencies. So at this stage, we're adding and subtracting minimal amounts here, but it's just really to sculpt the kind of areas that I'm going to probably want to add further processing with more toneful plugins. So I'm going to leave this as it is, and next I'm going to move down to another EQ, but something that's got a little bit more flavor to it. For that, I'm going to go to a channel strip style plugin, and here I'm going to pick the SSL 4000E series from Plugin Alliance. This is a great channel strip. I'm going to turn the dynamics section off and just leave the EQ section in for now. So what I'm doing there is utilizing the same kind of curves that we've got from our channel EQ here, which is quite a sterile EQ, and just adding some more volume here and taking away some volume in the same areas as the previous EQ, but with an EQ that has a different tone and flavor to it. As you see here, I've also added this THD control, which stands for Total Harmonic Distortion. This is basically more saturation to the drums as a whole. We then have an overall output volume here. Which I can keep at 0. Now I'm not going to use the compressor section from this processor here. I'm simply just going to use the EQ. The reason I've chosen to use the channel strip as a whole and not just the EQ as a standard plugin on its own is because of this total harmonic distortion area and this overall volume control. It's just a nice addition to have those further controls within your EQ. Next, I'm going to do some parallel compression, but within a series channel strip. To do this, I'm going to use a Universal Audio 1176 and take advantage of this mix control. Put in this mix control so the majority percentage is clean signal. We can add in some harder compression here. I'm going to go for an 8:1. I'm going to go for a medium attack, but a very fast release. So again, we're adding quite a lot of compression there, but only on a small percentage amount. And with this mix control here, this gives us the ability to do that. So we don't have to utilize any parallel processing. We can keep it as a series plugin, just run a small percentage of it. I'm going to listen to my drum bus without the effects. And then with. So as you can hear, with some slight EQ and some in-series parallel compression, we've got a far more exciting drum track. The next thing I'm going to experiment with on my drum bus is some envelope shaping. To do this, I'm going to go to the XLN Audio's DS10 drum shaper. This works as a standard transient designer, where we can add more or less attack to the transient portion, and then more or less sustain to the tail end of our transients. And as you can hear, it's very slight and subtle. However, it's just tightening up those drums where the transients hit, which then again exaggerates our quantization, keeping all of the drum playing and individual parts tighter together. Again, just to make this more drastic, I'm going to pull the sustain all the way down. And now you can hear those hi-hats and percussive elements sound a little bit more skippy, almost a sidechain style. And doing this brings the kicks and the snares far more forward within the mix. So again, without any processing. And then with. Now I'm going to come into a utility and a gain plugin. And what we're going to do here is pull back on the gain by a decibel, but then listen to what this sounds like in mono. Now, we mentioned this at the start of the course. As this is an electronic style track, there's a very good chance it will get played in clubs. And most club situations are mono sound systems. So we need to make sure, even though we've done minimal panning, that it still sounds good in mono. So now at this stage, we can look at going into the individual parts and start processing these further, working them into our mix bus chain for our drums. So now we've got a framework, we can look at the individual categories and start processing them. First, we're going to start with the kit, because this is the most important part of our overall drum track, and we're just going to listen to this in solo. So as you can see here, I've just looped over a single kick. Most of the kicks here have identical transient shapes to them, so there's not much change to the standard kick. Now you'll find this a lot with electronic music. It's quite different when it comes to live recorded kicks. So for the majority of the time in this track, the kicks are going to be exactly the same sounding as each other. I'm going to drag and drop this multimeter here to the end of the track, just so we can look at what the kick itself is doing. Now we can see that this is a mono kick. It's 100% in the positive section here, and it's straight down the middle of our mix. Now the philosophy behind the kick drum is that it anchors the track and holds the bass section of our drum track as a whole. And if I just hold my peak here, you can see this is the overall shape of our drums. Now the initial transient of the drum is around about 200 Hertz here, and then we see this roll down with a pitch roll for the tail of the kick that goes all the way down to around about 60 Hertz. Now this can be seen here by the shape of the kick itself. We can see we get the initial transient here, which then slowly goes down, and then we get our roll down into the tail end of the kick. So if I bring up the mixer again, we can see that roll represented here. It starts higher up in the frequency range, around about that 200 area, and then rolls all the way down to about 60. So it does cover a wide range of frequency. We can already see that we've got a healthy amount of low frequency range in our kick. So at this point, there's no real need to add any more bass amplitude to the lower frequencies. You can see that we've got a small amount of presence on the top of our kick here, but not a lot of smack in the higher frequencies. And that's okay for a kick drum, because other elements in our drums will be taking up this space. What we can hear at the moment is this roll in pitch down does last for quite a long time. So what I'm going to do is pick another form of transient design. For this, I'm going to pick the SPL Transient Designer Plus. This plugin, much like the drum shaper here, deals with the attack and the sustain portions of incoming signals. What I'm going to do is have a look at my analyzer here while I shorten off the length of the pitch drift from higher frequency to lower frequency with the tail end of our kick. As we can hear, it's doing the right sort of thing, but even though we're adding more attack, it's not giving us a hard enough attack to add to some of these higher frequencies. So I'm going to try and find a different transient shaper. I'm going to pick the standard enveloper from Logic. Now if we look here at these frequencies, around about 2K, we can see that this would be the initial impact in the higher frequency range of our kick. But now when I bring in the attack portion of our enveloper plugin, this should now go a little bit higher. And the further we go up in gain, is the higher the frequency amplitude is for this presence area. All it's doing is initially exaggerating those main transient parts, or the attack portion of our kick. We can then use the gain of our release function here to gain more presence and a little bit less of that tail. We can still hear the tail fully, and we can still hear that pitch drift from higher to lower. However, it just doesn't last as long, and it tails off in volume slightly quicker than before. This is going to add to the swing and groove of our track, and just clear out some of those lower frequencies in the areas where the kick isn't hitting its transient. As you can hear, it just cuts through the mix a little bit more. So let's listen to that with the rest of the drums. Hopefully there you can hear the kick just cut through that mix a little bit more. And with the addition of that reduction in tail, it just sounds a little bit tighter, giving more space for the percussion elements to shine through when the kicks aren't initially transient. Now, even though we do have a healthy amount of low frequency here, and the kick sits nicely in pitch with the rest of the drums, we could still look further into how we could repitch this kick drum and make it seem a little bit lower in frequency or higher in frequency. To do this, I'm going to use a standard EQ, and I'm going to go for the Plug-in Alliance Lindell 50. Now, this is an emulation of an API console. What I'm going to do is look at this EQ here and go for the 60, and this gives me a graphic EQ. This is where we can lift and duck certain areas of frequency over a tight fixed bandwidth. Now, with graphic EQs, the higher you go up or the lower you go down in volume determines the tightness of the bandwidth. So adding a large amount of, say, 125 Hz will be a tight cue point, whereas a small amount of 125 Hz will be a wider slope. What I'm going to do is turn off the VCA section here, which is our compressor section. And just leave that increase there at around about 125 Hz. Now, if we look at our multimeter, we'll see that that 125 Hz is around about the area in between the low part of the kick and the high part of the kick. What we should start to see here is an area around here between 62 to 250 get gradually larger and even out with the high part and the low part. So let's just loop round our drums again for the last drop. And as you can see here, we've added a little bit more gain to this area of frequency, exaggerating the pitch area for this kick. We could utilize gating a sine oscillator in order to get a defined pitch for the low end of the kick, but that might be something we come to later on. At the moment, this kick sounds pretty good as it is, and merges well with the rest of the drum track. We could utilize the compression here to get a small amount of additional control to the volume. Here we get the choice of the VCA and the FET versions of the compressor. Now, VCA can seem quite smooth and warm, but it has harsher characteristics when pushed a little bit more. So let's add this compression circuit in and see what we get, only taking off a small amount of gain reduction. I'm going to take advantage of this high pass filter here, just to cut out the very low frequencies. So all we're really doing is compressing higher than the sub area or the top end of our kick. So let's listen to it on its own. Here I've just lifted the ratio to 20:1 rather than 2:1, so the gain reduction will be more, which means we might have to make up a little bit more gain here. And as you can hear from that, we're getting a far more pronounced kick drum that again sticks out a little bit further within that mix. So just to recap, for the kick drum itself, we've gone for some transient shaping here, adding a little bit more attack to the transient start portion of the kick, and then taking away some of that tail, just with a reduction in volume over time. We've then added a small bit of EQ here to exaggerate the area between the two fundamental points of that kick in terms of its frequency. And then we've added some slight FET style compression here, only with around 2 decibels of gain reduction, but leveling out those volumes from transient initial hit all the way to the end of the tail. This has now created a more solid, dynamically consistent and punchy kick from start to finish. At this stage we can move on to the other elements of the track, but remember, you can always come back to this to adjust any parts, whether it's EQ or compression or any additional processes, once you start to add more processing to the other categories. It's now time to look at the snare portion of our drums. Now for the snare track here, I've added another multimeter so we can keep an eye on what's going on with the snares on their own. So let's solo it and have a listen. So if we have a look at this frequency curve, which we've got from our snare, we can see we've got 2 fundamental areas of frequency dominance. First of all, it's around about 200 to 250 Hertz, maybe up towards the 300 area. We then get a fairly substantial dip in the mid-range, and then moving up to, from around about 4 all the way up to around about 10, we've got another area of gain. We can see here we get a nice roll off in terms of low frequency, already giving us space for our kick drum dominance, so we don't necessarily have to cut any low frequency out. However, to be on the safe side, it's always a good idea just to do so. I'm going to pick a high voltage per octave and cut off everything below 100 Hertz. And this EQ that appears first in the track is purely just for low or high cut purposes. Now for this snare drum, I'm going to pick the same channel strip, the Lindell 50. I'm going to turn the compressor off and just deal with the EQ. But for this one, I'm going to pick the most basic form of EQ. This one's the 50A version, and I'm going to look for my mid-frequency here. And just add in some low frequency around about 200 Hertz on both my low frequency here and my mid frequency here. Doing these together gives you a far better control over how that curve is going to look. So let's have a look at what we're adding here, hopefully around about this area, by initiating our EQ. So as you can see, this area here, the dominant area, around about 200, which we're adding with these two bands, is giving us far more presence and body to our snare drum. So it's further forward in the mix and has a little bit more aggression added to it. Now I'm going to initiate the compressor within this channel strip. I want the attack to be fairly slow, as I want that initial transient to come through. And I want the release to be quite fast again. So when the compression does happen, it's going to release that compression quite quickly. I'm going to leave it at 4:1 and slowly bring our threshold down until we're seeing 2 to 4 decibels worth of gain reduction here. Just again to even out the dynamic range from the initial transient point of this snare through to the end of the tail. Then we're going to make up that gain with our gain control here. And then we can A-B between our processed channel strip snare and the snare we had to start with. As you can hear, it supports that kick so much more now, but it doesn't take away any frequencies from the kick. Even though our snare drum dominant frequency here is in the same sort of area as our higher part of our kick drum, you can hear that because we have a higher portion of frequency in the high frequency area, it doesn't cloud that kick too much, and it definitely doesn't get in the way of the kick, meaning the kick keeps its standard anchor point and the snare is there to support it. I'm going to add some harmonic distortion into this snare. And now I'm going to lift from 15k up by a couple of decibels, just in the very high range. I'm then going to compensate the gain just by a decibel here. So we can see the overall volumes for the loudest parts of our drum section, the kicks and the snares. The kick we've got coming in at around about -4, and then the snare around about -7. So the kick is still dominant in its peak, and the snare's nicely there just to support it. I might just pull down the brushed part of our snare here by a decibel or so. And now let's listen to the kick and the snare with no processing on the groups, and then with, and then with. As you can see, we're now hitting our mix bus process at a far higher volume. To compensate for this, we're just going to pull the tracks down by a decibel each. And as you can see, we've only gained 1 decibel of peak volume, but our perceived loudness for our kick and snare is far greater. Next, we can move on to looking at the hats and the percussion into the percussion effects, and then work our way back through to see if we need to make any more adjustments. Now we can move on to the hi-hat section. So I'm just going to solo this and play this through. Again, keeping an eye on our overall analyzer for the frequency content. Now ideally, we will see no frequency information down here for our hats group, as low frequency has no real place in higher frequency elements within the drum kit. And as you can see, that's represented nicely here. Now listening with the kick, and then listening to the swing of those hats, we could now take advantage of something called sidechain compression. Now what this is going to do is take a trigger from another element within the track and tell a compressor to duck whenever that element happens. So to do this in Logic, I'm going to go to my Dynamics menu, and I'm going to pick the standard Logic compressor. I'm going to go to the Platinum Verb, which is the basic digital style compressor, or the one with the least amount of obvious characteristic, as all of the other circuit types are modeled after a specific analog compressor. We're going to stick to this Platinum Digital, and I'm going to go to the graph view. This is going to give us a really good indication as to the shaping of our sidechain compression. Now we need to decide what is going to pull down the compressor for this track. And to do this, we go up to this sidechain selection here. I'm going to go to our bus, and I'm going to pick our bus 1, which is our kicks. Now what you will see is whenever the kick strikes, the compressor will engage, adhering to the controls that we've set lower down in our control section. Let's have a look at this represented in the graph. So as you can see, whenever the kick hits, it pulls the volume down. But at the moment, our release time is far too slow. So messing around with those controls there, we got to a point where our attack and our release times are extremely quick, meaning as soon as the kick hits, it's going to pull the volume down, and then as soon as that compression has reached our dedicated level, it's then going to release that back up extremely quickly, hopefully just in time for that next kick drum. And as we can see, that's represented here with our visual. Now what you will notice is that the sidechain is completely dependent on the shape of our trigger. And the shape of our kick drum here has an initial transient and then a bump for our tail in terms of amplitude. So the envelope shape of our reduction in volume is going to follow the bottom section here of our audio signal. And if we look closely at the compressor here, and get a close-up view of the shape of our reduction, we should see a replication of the shape of our kick drum in the reduction in volume. As you can see here, you can see the steps where it pulls down, releases, and pulls down again. This is reminiscent of being pulled down in volume here, slight bit of release, and then another pull down here, basically taking the shape and contour of the amplitude of our kick drum. So if your sidechain isn't working in the way that you want it to, even if you have very fast attacks and releases, it could be down to the shape of the kick drum itself. Now this is okay, however, what I'm going to do is duplicate this track over and make a dedicated kick track. So I'm going to duplicate the track here. Pull this down. I'm going to mute the track's output and name this sidechain. We're going to keep it in the drum folder, but now instead of using the bus output, I'm going to use the dedicated sidechain audio track. And as you can see, even though this track is muted, we're still getting that signal being sent to our compressor. Now what I can do is zoom into these individual kicks, and I can decide to shorten the length of our kick trigger. To do this quickly, I'm going to pick our scissor tool. I'm going to make a cut at our initial transient, and then I'm going to shorten the length of the trigger. Now from this point onwards, we can see the kicks are consistently rhythmic from start to finish. So I'm going to place these kicks where they would normally lie, making sure we have absolute snap regions selected instead of relative. This will make sure it will always snap to the grid regardless of where you've cut previously. And we're going to do this throughout the track. Now this may seem like a tedious approach, however once done once, we get the option to pack this as a folder. So we can get 4-bar sections for our sidechain. What we're going to do is drag this over to the same parts as where our initial drums start from. So let's take these 4 groups and put them here and here. So as you can see, our kicks are going to relate exactly to the kicks that we have in our main kick track. You can see here even though our secondary kick with all of the bass taken out, we could still have a sidechain trigger for these, reminiscent of what we have previously. So we're going to work our way through the track, adding in our sidechain trigger. And we can see this one ends here, so we'll lower the time frame for this section and then move to the start of the track and do the same thing again. So now wherever the kick hits, whether it's the main kick or the secondary kick with no bass, we've got sidechain triggers for all of it. We just don't have sidechain triggers here. For the build-up. Now we can come back and do this at a later date, but for now we're going to leave it. So we're going to go back to our hi-hats track here. As you can see, we have far more space between each of those hits. If I go back to select the bus instead, you can see even at the fastest settings, we're choking out some of that audio. But if I go back to a shorter initial trigger point, we have less audio time frame pulling down, so we get a far cleaner sidechaining. Next we can look at EQing this. But I'm going to do a dynamics style process of EQ. And to do this, we're going to use the Fab Filter Pro Q3. We're going to pick a standard flat 7-band. And I'm going to make this shelf here dynamic. Pulling the threshold down. So we keep the tone, but get rid of some of that harshness in the very top end. I'm going to pull this higher up, just so it doesn't start as high. And we're only putting down really the very high section of frequency here, from around about 8,500 Hertz and higher. You can see from this EQ's analyzer, we do have some low frequency content. So I'm going to turn on my low cut frequency. And we're going to adjust this to the point at which our audio is most dominant within our hi-hat sound. So what we're going to do is select our hi-hat group, our kick group and our snare group, listen to the track with no processing, and then listen into it with. And then with. We've got a far tighter drum track with the three main element categories within our drums. We can always adjust the levels of our groups here. I'm going to come back and adjust the brushed part of our snare drum here a little bit higher again, as we did duck it down some more previously. Okay, so now we're in a good place with the hats, snares and kicks. I'm going to experiment a little bit more with the panning. So we are moving back in terms of what we've already done, but now we've got more of an idea of the overall sound of the main parts of our drums. We can afford to open it a little bit wider. And we can see this from the goniometer here. We only have a slight amount of stereo width. So let's see what this sounds like when we pan these out a little bit further, starting with these shakers and hats. And with that slight adjustment, pulling out further the hi-hats, we get a wider stereo image, and the general kick, snare and overall hats themselves get a bit more space within the mix. In the next video, we're going to look at the percussive elements within the track and try and balance these up, and again look further into our overall balance, as we've only got a minimal amount of panning here, and any kind of equalization or dynamics control, really just to add into the groove that our kick, snare and hat categories have already begun to make. Now we're on to the penultimate section of our drums, the percussion. Now this holds a vast amount of different sounds. However, all of these sounds feature in a similar area in terms of frequency, not just with themselves, but also with the hats. So it's important to differentiate between each of the sounds and mix them in terms of their balance, their panning and their dynamics control, so we can still hear every single element. Now so far with the kick, snare and hats, we've got the three main parts of our drums down. And our percussion parts here are really there to add flavour and groove to the sound. Previously, we flex timed these parts in order to make them adhere to a specific groove, so all of the drums are working at the same groove of each other to tighten that sound up. However, if we play this on its own, we still have quite a lot of tail and some low frequency here on the overall group. I'm going to pick the Pro Q3 as our first plug-in here, and again we're going to go for a flat 7 band, and we're going to look at the overall frequency content with a different analyzer. Now it's important to understand that there's no analyzer better than any other one, they're just different flavors. So having one as a multimeter with bars, and then having one that's more real time as a curve, which we'll see from this Pro Q3, can be really beneficial. It just gives you 2 or more points of reference. As you can see in this one here, we've got a lot more low frequency visible from the analyzer. So again, I'm going to take away all of this low frequency so it doesn't get in the way of our kick and the lower parts of our snare. And again, I'm going to make this band dynamic. and adjust the curve of this shelf, just so we're really getting those higher portions. And then widening out these rim shots. So let's have a look at this stereo width with just our high-end parts of the drums. So the percussion and the hats, no kicks or snares. So we're getting a wider stereo image, but staying well within our in-phase area here. What I am going to do is the same thing that I did with the hats and add some slight sidechain compression. Again, I'm going to pick the standard stock Logic compressor in its platinum digital state. I'm going to pick the audio track sidechain, and initially I'm going to copy our settings from the first compressor over to the second. And as you can hear from that, we've gained a little bit of volume, but only in the areas where the kick isn't happening. And all it's doing is adding to the groove. So let's listen to this with all of our parts in. And then take off all of that processing. And at this stage, I might change the parameter settings on our percussion sidechain compressor. And what we're doing here is just changing the knee so it's slightly smoother in terms of that reduction. Now what the knee will do in a compressor is it will determine the smoothness of how compression starts. A fast knee set to 0 will mean no compression will happen until the threshold has been physically breached, whereas a softer knee will look ahead and gradually smooth its way into compression. I'm going to have this about halfway here, as it's a little bit too smooth all the way up and a little bit too sharp all the way down. Now what I was doing there was just applying some wet and dry blend amount here. So what I've done here is basically give it 70% sidechain compression characteristic. Instead of fully sidechaining all the time, only 70% of the signal coming through this track will be the sidechained version, and 30% will be kept clean as the standard track. So what we're doing is, instead of leaning off the amount of sidechain compression we're doing, we're still getting a very hard amount of sidechain compression, but we're only having 70% of it within the mix, meaning we could theoretically turn the volume down by doing this of our sidechain compression signal, getting it to the level that we feel sounds right. To me, 70% sounds right for now, as we're not taking away too much of that sizzle from the rides, but we are giving a little bit more bounce and rhythm and groove to the overall drum track. Lastly, I'm going to go for some sort of transient shaping. Now, we tried this plugin before and it didn't quite work. However, trying this on the percussion bus might give us some better results. So as you can hear, it's so much tighter now. So now would be a good time to go back and listen to our drums before and after any processing that we've done. I'm going to leave the effects percussion out just for now because these were more of our effects processes. And I'm going to look into a bit of automation and effects processing on the top of these later on. But I'm just going to select all of my tracks here, get rid of all of the processing, and then bring it back in just to hear where we started to where we've ended up, just looking at basic processing such as dynamics control and EQ. As you can hear, a lot of our processing sound is coming from our mix bus, and we've been working into that, so we've got a consistent idea of what our mix is going to sound like. So with nothing, and then with our mix bus process and individual category processes, let's compensate for this gain a bit more here. So now we're around about the same peak volume here. We can hear an obvious difference that isn't being altered by the fact that it's just louder. What we're hearing is an overall clearer, more vibey and energetic drum track. So again, without any processing. And let's keep our multimeter open. And then adding back in our processing. I've just lent off a little bit on that release function here, just so we can fill in those gaps a little bit more with bass information, now that we've cleared out a lot of those gaps with sidechain compression. So now we can move on to the effects percussion and start looking at possible automation throughout the track to make the transitions seem a little bit more exciting. Now we can start looking at adding the same sort of processes in terms of effects and automation to the individual categories that we have within our drums. Now, one of the first areas we can look at this is this area here where the kick drum drops down to a second clip, which has all of the low frequency taken out. This is the clear indication that something in the track is either going to drop down to a section or build up to a higher section. And we can exaggerate that with the use of effects. So to do this, I'm going to pick another delay plugin. And I'm going to have this automated in over time. I'm going to pick a eighth note, and I'm going to put the feedback quite far down, really so we're getting a secondary delay of the initial sound rather than a continuous echo going round and round and round. Let's just listen to this and find a spot where we feel it's getting too far. So around about this area here, it started to get a little bit too far. So what we're going to do is place it at this area and automate it from this point down. So I've just opened the automation screen in Logic by pressing A. I'll come down to my Echo Boy and we'll go to the mix. Now I can click where this point is here and we can see that's at around 60%. And then I'm going to pull down to nothing here, making sure that we start at nothing as well. Even though there's no audio in this section, it's just good practice to make sure that you start and end your automation lines exactly where you want them to be. And again here I'm just going to curve this line by pressing Ctrl and Shift and dragging down. And that sounds quite nice, so I'm going to do the same sort of thing. So I'm going to do the same sort of thing that I did with the effects percussion and add some form of reverb. However, now I'm going to choose a different style of reverb. I'm going to go to the Verb Suite Classics here from Slate Digital and pick the classic 480L preset here, just as you open the plugin. So that's the full wet reverb. Let's pull this down to nothing. So again, just as before, I'm going to automate this in from a certain point. So to view this as another automation lane, I can just press the drop down arrow and then pick what I want to see from this lane. So we'll go to the dry wet mix. That was where we got to. We're going to pull this down again. And again, make sure that our breakpoint starts from a flat line. Let's try that higher up. And maybe curve the line. So let's go back a little bit further into the track and just see if we're actually adding more excitement here. What I think I'm going to do is just filter that down as well, so it filters down into those effects. Now to do this we're going to utilize automation again, but I'm just going to use a standard channel EQ from Logic as the first plugin and gradually pull the high frequency away. Just so it feels as though it disappears into the back of the mix and reverberates out. So again, we're going to go to our automation screen. We're going to drop down our available views and just add another. And we're going to pick the channel EQ's high cut frequency. And we're going to slowly bring this down. Again, making sure we've got a breakpoint to where we started from. Now we might be able to get away with more reverb and more delay. And give a little bit more frequency towards the end there. Again, possibly curving the line so it's less linear. Okay, so that's the first section sorted. Let's move on to the second area. And as you can see here, we've ended up very high, so we can now adjust these back to a standard level or a different level compared to what we started with. So let's start the mix here far lower and gradually work our way into that. Okay, so we've got our transitions for those kicks sorted. We've got some other areas to look at here. We're going to pull back on all of them for this one here, as it's only a slight section. So let's pull the reverb down for this here. And then lastly, this section. And we'll finish with the same thing for this. So now we've added a little bit more excitement to these different areas and transition points. Obviously, we don't have any vocals or instrumentation to be working with, but doing things like this will give more attention to those parts, as you can think of effects automation like this as kind of like punctuation for different sections of a track. As a story goes through, different things swell in and out, and doing it with effects instead of just basic volumes can create a little bit more environment around the track and just a more exciting experience from start to finish. We're now at the point in the mix where we can start to look at our effects percussion. Now, I've marked all of these out, as mentioned before, as more effects style percussive parts. So things that indicate a new section coming in or breakpoints within the track that could be builds or breakdowns. We can hear just by playing the track first, this initial crash, which I'll just drag up to the top here, is quite dry and could definitely do with some form of atmosphere around it. And this is where the effects can come into it. So first of all, on this track, I'm going to go for a reverb, and I'm going to pick a plate reverb from the Sound Toys bundle, the little plate. Now I want this to last quite long. So using this reverb here, we've added a fair amount of decay time here, around about 9 seconds. We've cut off all the lower frequencies, which aren't really going to be present in our percussion here for this track. To be on the safe side, let's open up an EQ in front of it. So now I have a bit more space around this. Let's listen to what it sounds like when we have a cluster of them brought together. That sounds quite nice, but it's a little bit too loud in the mix, so we'll pull this mix amount down so we're getting more dry than we are wet signal. And then we could afford to give it a slightly longer decay. Next we're going to look at some delay here. So again, from the Sound Toys bundle, I'm going to pick the Echo Boy Junior. Now there is a fuller version of this plugin, however the Junior does just fine for what we need it to do. We've got loads of different sounds and characteristics for our delays. We've got some saturation, and then overall control over the timing of our delay, how long it will last for, and what kind of delay will it be. I'm going to leave this as a wide version here, and I'm going to bring this down to a quarter note. Now it's important to note that we've set our BPM of the session to 129, and our tracks are lined up to grid quite nicely. This means that whatever we set our delay to, the timing is going to be perfectly right and always stay in time and in rhythm. So let's listen to see what this sounds like. Here I can cut out some of the high frequencies. We'll make the decay a little bit longer with the feedback and bring down the mix. And then we can play around with some of these different tape styles. So as you can hear, they're all very different. The Plex sounds kind of nicer here, as the delays, even though we've set our high and low cuts here, we get a nice frequency range just for that delay to ring out. Let's exaggerate this just to see how it sounds over time. So that sounds kind of nice there. And now I'm going to put the reverb after the delay. So instead of us delaying our reverb signal, we're delaying the original signal, but adding reverb to that as a whole. So let's listen to that drop here into what could be the verse part. Now let's listen to those reverse parts here. Again, I'll drag this track up higher. As you can hear, it's already covered in quite a lot of effects, reverb and delay already. So let's see if that matches. It sounds kind of nice as it is. But what I will do is duplicate the reverb over for the one that we've already used, just to add the same atmosphere without the need for delay on our riser track. So now they blend together in the same space. Let's hear our tambourine transition. That does sound kind of nice on its own. As again, we can hear it's got a fair bit of reverb on it. But again, I'm just going to duplicate this reverb over. Now we could have done this as a parallel process, However, doing it this way does give us a large amount of control, still with the use of a parallel amount with a mix control here. And it means that we can have various styles and times of delay for each of the different effects. So let's have a listen to a space where all of our effects are playing. Okay, so we've got a bit of atmosphere in our little breakdown sections. So now we can start to look at adding this same sort of processing, but with more automation possibilities throughout different sections of the track. Let's just go to the end of the track, just to make sure that all of our transition effects, or our effects percussion, is working nicely with the drops. So we've got a good level there and a nice amount of excitement. So next let's move on to adding this same process with automation possibilities to the different elements and categories that we've already started working with. Now we've looked at adding a little bit more character into the track with effects, we can start to add more to different sections. I'm just going to do some slight changes here to the snare category. As you can see here, the start of the track we have an 8 bar, and then it moves into a 16 bar, then into our breakdown part. So for this little section here, where we get to bar 17, I want to do something slightly different to the snares, just to introduce the next section. Again, we don't have any other instrumentation parts to this track, but due to the style of the track that this will be a good break point to just do something a little bit different, to change the cycle from a 16 bar into what would now sound like 2 separate 8 bars. To do this, I'm going to set up a bus, and on this bus I'm going to put some reverb. So I've set up bus 10 here, and I'm going to pick the Eventide Black Hole reverb. I'm going to set this to a full wet mix. And I'm going to automate this to come in on one of the snare hits just before bar 17. So this snare hit here. Now let's have a listen and see what each of those snares sound like individually. So if we were to add the reverb to this track, it would sound like this. And if we were to add that to this track instead, it would sound like this. So we have more of a high frequency reverb from this snare than we do to this snare. I think it sounds quite nice with this one, so let's have a listen. Compared to this track. So let's automate this in on the first track here. I'm going to come to my automation screen and then pick from the main, sends, and absolute here. This is going to be our send level. So we're going to drag this all the way down to the bottom and only lift this up at this point before bar 17. Now the reason we're doing this on a bus is because all we're doing is sending a copy of this snare track off to some reverb here. And the good thing about doing that is that we're not cutting off the reverb sound when we close the send. Because it's just being sent in, we're not cutting the volume off of the effect, we're just cutting the amount that we send into that effect. If I was to put this reverb on the track itself in series, if we were to then lower the mix of that, we would then have no reverb. And we could achieve things like gated reverbs, but in this case we want that reverb to play out just by throwing some information into it for a slight amount of time. So I'm going to do the same thing for the next track. We're going to come to our main absolute here. Let's turn it on. Bring it all the way down. And then again, draw in our points of where we want it to bring in the reverb. We can compensate down for both, as now we're adding two different versions. So let's have a listen to that in terms of an 8-bar section. So it just gives us an indication that we're moving into a secondary section before we get to here. And I'll do the same again for the snare before. Now that feeds nicely into our kick effects automation. And again here, just before the drop. Let's move on through the sections. And we'll just do this throughout the track to build into the transition effects that we've already built with our kick drum. And each time just doing it slightly different, sending various amounts of each track, you're going to get a slightly different reverb for each transition effect. For instance, I might go a lot higher on this one and a bit lower on this one. And then higher on this one and lower on this one. Maybe just this one for this section, as it's the brighter of the two. Coming out of this section for the last breakdown. As you can see, it does take quite a lot of time, but it just gives you full control over exactly how your transitions are going to sound. And doing it this way is slightly different every time. And again here, as though it doesn't really fit without any effects around it, just for that last snare drum. And as this one is kind of the penultimate one, let's give this the most amount of effects. And then lastly, to finish the track, So as you can see, as we move through the track, we're getting more and more effects going within our snare here, just in terms of reverb. Depending on what track is being sent to the reverb and by how much is going to determine the sort of atmosphere we create. We can see as we go through the track, we get louder and louder with our reverbs. So it starts off quite modest and then grows throughout the track, which means the excitement and the transition options could generally be greater. So now we've looked at pretty much every aspect of putting our drums together, including some form of effects automation. And remember, the things that I've shown in these videos aren't where it ends. You could be doing effects automation to all different aspects here, but it completely depends on the style of drums that you're working with at the time. But saying that, now we can look at further processing to our drum bus as a whole. Now we've got a general sound. So first of all, let's just go back to our last drop here. And I'm going to take out all of our effects processing. So I'll cover all the tracks here and take out all of the effects processing. So all we're going to be listening to is the overall balance that we had when we dragged in the stems initially, and we looked at the overall gain and volume balance of those tracks. Then I'm going to bring the plugins in so we can hear what we've done to the track so far. To start with, we've looked at general balance and gaining, but then with these plugins, we've added dynamics control as well as equalization, and just trying to keep hold of the tightness of this track and the groove of this track, as initially it did sound quite differing in terms of the times. So let's listen to it before anything, and then after about 4 to 8 bars, we'll bring the processing in. So as you can hear, it's so much more punchy. It cuts through the mix quite a lot. We can hear the compression there on the snare drum, just holding it really solid in place. We can break down some of that compression here on the snare. However, I do like the sound of this. At this stage, it's dependent on personal opinion, really. But for this style of track, I'm thinking it's sounding really nice. It's adding more to the punch of the track. And it's just generally adding more emphasis on the swing that we've created by snapping and flexing the time of our percussion parts. So again, without. And then with the processing. And as you can see here, we've only gone up around about a decibel in terms of overall gain added. However, it sounds far louder than that in its perceived loudness. But as mentioned before, let's look at our overall drum track here. And I'm going to add in some more parallel processing. Now, I'm not going to add any parallel compression to this drum track, as we've already added some here with the compressor on the track itself as our third insert. What I am going to add is some form of saturation. So I'm going to come to bus 11 here. Let's name this saturate. And just to be on the safe side, so I know what I have on this bus is the reverb. And here I'm going to go for the decapitator from Sound Toys. And we're going to send our drums for this. And just solo the decapitator so we can hear just what that is doing. So around about there is quite nice. We did try the punish there, but it's just far too much for this style of saturation that we're going for. But adding this into the track underneath is going to sound quite nice. So let's just play it without this and then bring this into the mix. Now I'm liking the level that I'm sending and the amount of distortion that I'm getting, however it's a little bit too loud. But because we've got this set up as a bus send, I can just take control of the volume of the overall output of this saturation. So I'm going to start from the bottom and gradually bring it into the mix. Now, listening to it in context with the rest of the mix, the E style sounds like it gives the most amount of excitement to the track overall. I might just compensate that down in gain slightly. Okay, so adding that to the overall mix, we're getting again around about a decibel's worth of overall gain added, but we're still overall in our drum sound at around about -5, which is kind of okay for an overall drum peak level at the mix at this stage. And if we do need to compensate for anything in our overall mix bus at the end of the track, we've only got a decibel really to play with. Now, if we select this as a track in the mixer and control click, we get the option to create this track in the session. So now this shows up as a possible automation lane within our Logic project. Now, why this is important is that we can have various volumes or amounts of our overall saturation adding throughout the track. For instance, at the start of the track, we could start the track with no saturation added. So let's try that now. Let's go through the track here and we can see the different sections, of the track laid out within our groups. I'm going to start with the volume of our saturation here, standard to where we want to keep it as an overall fixed volume, as we don't necessarily want it to go any higher than this in the rest of the track. And I still might want an overall volume control after my automation. So to make this work, I'm going to go to a standard gain plugin from the utilities menu and automate the gain here. This is basically now our new output fader strictly for automation purposes. And because it is pre-fader, we still get an overall relative volume control at the end of it that won't move or snap when our timeline changes, as this is not the thing being automated. So I'm going to start from 0 here. And I know that 0 decibels is the place we're going to get to at our highest point of our master volume. So let's find this in the plugin list. We'll keep this at 0. We can then bring the gain up slowly . To this point here, let's open up the track a little bit longer. Or maybe put this to -13. And as we get to the last chorus, we can then build this up over the time frame of the breakdown up to 0 decibels. So now, as you can see, as the track goes through its cycle, we're adding saturation gradually. The beginning of the track, I'll lift slightly here. And make sure it comes in on point. So we're just adding a little bit more excitement to the track overall. Now I can bring this up in volume. see we've got quite a drastic change in volume there for the last drop, but we're not really adding a lot of overall volume on our peak output. So just by doing this, we're adding more excitement to the track as it moves on again, following the same kind of idea as our effects automation throughout the snares and the kicks. It's at this point for this style of track that the drum mix is pretty much finished. We can just go back and look at any last final touches. Now there were a few places in the snare drum here, mainly on these fills, that stood out to be a little bit static compared to the other percussive parts that we've added automation to. So I'll just play them through here, listening to this section. So just these snare fills here. Even though there is some slight stereo width to them, it would be really nice to have these move left and right, but over time. So to do this, I'm going to go to the Melder Productions plugins here and pick the Auto Pan. I'm going to set the sync to 8th note, and we're going to have a listen to this and see how far we can get in terms of spread. Let's put this on a square wave so it's more defined left and right rather than a movement from left to right. And what I'm going to do is just automate the depth of this. Up to around about that point. So let's open up the rest of the drums and just see how wide this gets in terms of the width of the rest of the drums. Maybe a little bit less. So around about there. So again, we can open up our automation lane, find the auto pan, and look for the depth. We're going to start from this point. So it gradually opens over time. And what I'm going to do is select this whole area here, and then copy and paste this over to another section. But because this lasts for less time, let's adjust the timing. So some slight movement there, and let's follow on for the rest of the track. And just copy and pasting these over, holding down the Option key and clicking and dragging. So now I'm going to pick all of these here and copy and paste these over to correspond here. So now at this stage, we've pretty much finished the mix for our drums. Now we can add in other elements to the track, things like basses, lead instruments and vocals, and make any adjustments that need to be done from that point. But at least at this point, we know that we have a solid foundation for our drums, not just in terms of its overall frequency and dynamics content, but in terms of giving hints to different areas for the track to come in and out, with various transition effects automation.